sometimes this is called shamatha with no object. Now, the general recommendation is use the object that works best for you in this practice, and probably for many of us here, at least initially, the breath will probably be the best object. But there is another, and so the idea is to pick an object that works for you and then stick with that object. And we can use that object along all the stages of the shamatha practice, which we're going to look at later in the retreat. But there's another possibility, another option that we could do, and that's mentioned here in Attention Revolution by Alan Wallace on page 6, and he says the following: to guide meditators along these 10 stages, and the 10 stages are the ones described in this diagram here, which we're going to be looking at a little bit later in the retreat. He says, to guide meditators along these 10 stages, I have chosen from Buddhist teachings 3 techniques that I have found effective for people in the modern world. These 3 techniques are the basis for the 3 divisions of this book. For the first 4 stages, you should practice whatever method you find easiest. By stage 5, the mind is relatively stable and you can move on to subtler techniques. For achieving the first 4 stages, I recommend the practice of mindfulness of breathing, variations of which can be found in Zen, Vipassana and Tibetan Buddhism. Mindfulness of breathing means settling your awareness on the sensations involved in breathing, continually returning your attention there whenever your mind wanders. Beginning with the 5th stage, I recommend a method called settling the mind in its natural state. So that's the name he gives to the practice we're doing today. In this technique, you direct your attention to mental experiences, that is, all the events, such as thoughts, mental images and emotions that arise in the domain of the mind. This method is drawn from the Dzogchen lineage, but is found in other Buddhist traditions as well. With the instructions for the 8th attentional stage onward, we move on to the still subtler practice of maintaining awareness of awareness itself. So that's the practice for tomorrow. This technique is called shamatha without an object. Here the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and clarity as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself. The training in mindfulness of breathing may be helpful to anyone, including those seeking to prevent or treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Many people find the second practice, that of settling the mind in its natural state, to be more challenging, but some meditators take to it naturally. Likewise, the practice of awareness is subtler still, but it may be optimal from the beginning for those who are strongly drawn to it. You may use any one of the 3 methods to progress along all 10 stages of attentional development, or you may follow the sequence described in this book. How fast you progress will depend on the level of your commitment and the degree to which your lifestyle and environment support such practice. So he's suggesting that a viable alternative is to start with the breath, because that's most easy for many of us. Work with that for some time until we really get into the practice, and he's suggesting to about stage 4, and we'll look at what those stages are a little bit later in the retreat. And then from stage 4 up till about stage 7 or 8, we can then shift to observing the mind. And once we get to about stage 8, then we can shift to resting in awareness. Or we can use the breath the whole way, we could use the mind the whole way, we could use awareness the whole way. This also. But sort of changing the object from one day to the next continually is not really going to be very effective. Each of these 3 objects that we're using in this retreat has, of course, its own unique benefits. The breath is very helpful in getting us out of our discursive minds and into the present moment. The mind, which we're doing today, is very useful to help us to become the masters of our mind, instead of being the slaves of our mind, instead of being overwhelmed and tormented by our thoughts, emotions and memories. And it's very much a healing practice. And the practice we're doing tomorrow, the awareness practice, really helps us to get out of this obsessive compulsive doing mode that many of us find ourselves in, more into being mode. And instead of having a very tight and constricted mind, we can have a very open and spacious mind. And the practice we're doing today and tomorrow, also, due to the nature of the practice, is very much a bridge into the Vipassana practice, the insight practice. So that simply by observing our mind or resting in awareness, we can really start to intuitively come to an insight into the very nature of our mind, which is Vipassana practice. So these practice today and tomorrow are very well known as a bridge into Vipassana practice as well. Now, as we're going to see in this chart later in the retreat, as we move through these stages of shamatha and our mind becomes more and more focused, what you will find is that slowly our sense faculties in meditation will start to become dormant. Which means actually at the higher levels of practice, we're not going to even be able to focus on the sensations of the breath, because our sense faculty will slowly shut down because of the increased mental focus. Fortunately, if we're using the tactile sensations of the breath as our object, before that happens, we get what's called an acquired sign, which is a mental image that spontaneously arises in our mind that's relating to the breath. And when that image arises, and it's not something we generate, it just spontaneously arises, we shift our focus from the sensations of the breath to that mental image, and we use that for the rest of the way to shamatha. And to just briefly describe that, Alan Wallace talks about that on page 64 in his Attention Revolution. He says the following: in the phase of mindfulness of breathing thus far, you have been attending in various ways to the tactile sensations of the breath. However, to continue all the way along the path to shamatha, eventually you must shift your attention from the tactile sensations of breathing to an acquired sign, a symbol of the air element that appears before the mind's eye as you progress in the shamatha practice. To different people, acquired signs associated with the breath practice may appear like a star, a cluster of gems or pearls, a wreath of flowers, a puff of smoke, a cobweb, a cloud, a lotus flower, a wheel, or sun or moon. The various appearances of the acquired sign are related to the mental dispositions of individual meditators. If you wish to continue on the path of mindfulness of breathing, which here explicitly turns into mindfulness with breathing, as soon as such a sign arises, shift your attention to this sign. This will be your object of attention as you proceed along the rest of the 9 stages leading to shamatha. At first, your sign will arise only sporadically, so when it disappears, return to the previous sensations of the breath. But eventually it will appear more regularly and steadily, and from that point onward, focus your attention on this object. As you progress in this practice, increase the duration of your sessions for as long as you are able to maintain the quality of attention relatively free of laxity and excitation. I remember many years ago when I first did one of these Goenka Vipassana retreats, and of course there you're doing a lot of focusing at the nostrils. And I remember after that retreat I was talking to someone who obviously was doing this practice a lot, and he asked me, he said, "Did you see the blue light?" And I go, "Blue light? What are you talking about?" I think he may have been referring to this acquired sign. So this, a quiet sign, is not something visual. It's not something you see with your eyes. It's a mental image. And that mental image can be very different depending on the meditator. And this mental image appears when we go much deeper into the breath practice, and it can appear in many different forms depending on the individual meditator. And when that appears, then you shift your attention from the sensations of the breath to that object, and you use that the rest of the way to Shamatha. So that's just a little bit of information about how we progress using the breath. So let's now go to the practice we're doing today and look at it in a little bit more detail. So the object here is the mind. So when we say the mind, what do we mean? What is the object? The object is the mind and whatever mental events appear in the mind. So mental events are, of course, things like thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. So what's not part of the object is sense objects. So in this practice, we're not focusing on visual objects, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations in the body. We're not interested in those. Of course, sounds will still arise, sensations will still arise in the body. Let them be there, that's okay. We're just not focusing on them. We're only focusing on mental events as the object. And of course, we are simply observing these mental events as they arise and pass. So in this practice, we're not trying to make the mind still. If you've ever tried to make your mind still, you know it doesn't work. And in this practice, thoughts are not problems. In the breath practice, thoughts were problems. If they came up, we had to let them go and come back to the breath. In this practice, thoughts are part of the object. So let them be. We simply watch them as they arise and pass. So in this practice, actually, to have no preference whether the mind is still or there's lots of things going on in the mind. Actually, in some ways, it's good if there's lots of things going on in the mind, because then we've got something to really pay attention to, observe. If the mind is very still and quiet, there's very much a danger that we just sort of drift into a very dull state. Whereas at least if there's lots of thoughts and emotions coming up, it helps us to pay close attention to those. So just to describe that a little bit, I'd like to read again from Alan Wallace on page 83. He says the following. The object of mindfulness in the practice of settling the mind in its natural state, and that's the name he gives to this practice, is no longer the subtle sensations of the breath, but the space of the mind and whatever events arise within that space. The object of introspection, as in the earlier practice of mindfulness of breathing, is the quality of the attention with which you're observing the mind. Now he's quoting a meditation text here which says, "At the beginning, have many daily sessions, each of them of brief duration, and focus well in each one. Whenever you meditate, bear in mind the phrase, and the phrase is, without distraction and without grasping, and put this into practice." So now he's commenting on that. He says, as you venture into this practice, I would encourage you to memorize these quintessential instructions, which are, settle your mind without distraction and without grasping. Practicing without distraction means not allowing your mind to be carried away by thoughts and sense impressions. Be present here and now, and when thoughts arise pertaining to the past or future, or ruminations about the present, don't be abducted by them. As you hike on this trail of Shamatha, don't be a hitchhiker catching a ride with any of the thoughts or images that whiz through your mind. Rather be like a kestrel hovering motionlessly as it faces the wind, slightly moving its wings and tail feathers to adjust to changes in the currents of the air. Even when your attention is settled in the present, you may still grasp onto the appearances to the mind. Whenever you prefer one mental object over another, whenever you try to control the contents of your mind, and whenever you identify with anything at all, grasping has set in. Here is the challenge at hand. Be attentive to everything that comes up in the mind, but don't grasp onto anything. In this practice, let your mind be like the sky. Whatever moves through it, the sky never reacts. It doesn't stop anything from moving through it. It doesn't hold on to anything that's present, nor does it control anything. The sky doesn't prefer rainbows to clouds, butterflies to jet planes. Whatever comes up in the field of awareness, without distraction or grasping, just let it be. One more thing and then we'll go to the practice. In meditation in general, the general recommendation is to have the eyes at least slightly open, because if we have them closed, we simply drift into dullness. But here in this practice and the practice we're going to do tomorrow, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open, either partially or just naturally, whichever you prefer. And there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, with eyes open, it helps to improve clarity of attention. With eyes closed, it's much easier to drift into dullness and drowsiness. Also, with eyes open, it helps to lock us more into the present moment. With the eyes closed, it's much easier to drift off into the past and the future. Also, if we do this practice with eyes open, it helps us to more easily transition into daily life. Because also in daily life, we'd like to be able to observe our thoughts and emotions without getting caught up in them. But if we've only ever meditated with eyes closed, observing thoughts and emotions, then it's harder to bring that to daily life. Because generally in daily life, we have our eyes open. But if we've only developed the habit of observing thoughts and emotions with eyes closed, then it's going to be difficult to do that in daily life. So therefore, if we meditate with eyes open, observing thoughts and emotions, it's much easier to bring that into daily life. And then the last point is that with eyes closed, we really have a strong sense that there's a me in here and a world out there. So we have this strong sense of subject-object duality. Whereas with eyes open, this sense of duality starts to break down. There's not such a strong sense of me in here and a world out there. And of course, this is what we're coming to try to realize in Vipassana practice, that there is no subject-object duality. There is no independent me, independent world. Everything's interdependent. So if we do this practice with eyes open, in the Shamatha practice here, it helps to break down this false sense of duality, which is going to be very helpful later when we go into Vipassana practice. And on that point, I'd just like to read a little bit from Alan Wallace. He also comments on this on page 86. And he's quoting a meditation text which says, "Let your gaze be vacant." And then he comments on that. He says, "In this practice, it is important that your eyes are open, vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you. If you have not meditated with your eyes open, you may find this uncomfortable, but I encourage you to get used to it." And this was my experience. When I first started meditating many years ago, I was a very agitated sort of person, and I found having the eyes closed helped to reduce the agitation. But of course then slowly into dullness. But then when I was introduced to this practice some years ago, and then I started meditating with the eyes open, I really found it very uncomfortable. But actually I quickly got used to it. Now generally I only meditate with eyes open. And he says, blink as often as you like and don't strain your eyes in any way. So it's not like we're trying to hold the eyes open. Blink as often as you need. And we're not trying to deliberately unfocus the gaze. If we try and deliberately unfocus, we're straining the eyes. So just keep them soft and relaxed. So he says here, let them be as relaxed as if you were daydreaming with your eyes open. By leaving the eyes open, while focusing your attention on the domain of mental events, the artificial barrier between inner and outer begins to dissolve. Especially in our materialist society, we have gotten used to the idea that our thoughts and all other mental events are inside our heads. But this has never been demonstrated scientifically. All that is known in this regard is that mental events are correlated with neural events, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are located in the same place. Even without this materialist assumption that the mind is nothing more than a function of the brain, we naturally have a sense that we are looking out on the world from behind our eyes. But this sense of an independent subject or ego inside the head is an illusion. There is no scientific support for such a belief, and when it is inspected through rigorous contemplative inquiry, this autonomous thinker and observer inside the head is nowhere to be found. In this practice, by leaving your eyes open, but by directing your attention to the mind, this conceptually superimposed demarcation between inner and outer begins to erode. You begin to recognize that your thoughts are not occurring in here in your head, nor are they occurring out there in space. This practice challenges the existence of an absolutely objective space of the physical senses that is absolutely separate from the subjective space of the mind. You are now on a path to realizing the meaning of non-duality. So that's basically the practice that we're going to be doing today. So let's do that practice. So again, remember, we are eyes open, so either partially or naturally, just resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And then we're simply observing our mind and whatever is arising in the mind. Simply observing thoughts, emotions, memories and mental images as they arise and pass, just like an impartial observer or witness. So let's do that practice. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Now allowing the eyes to be at least partially open, vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed, blinking as often as you need. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. Simply observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass, without grasping to them, without trying to get rid of them.